Missouri is a place with thick forests, winding rivers, and secrets hidden in the Ozark Hills. This area was still having trouble making progress at the start of the 20th century. Small, isolated towns were connected by dirt roads, and the law often arrived too late. In 1912, the world was changing quickly in the big cities of the East, but here, in the middle of nowhere, time seemed to move at a different speed. People lived off of farming, small trade, and the trust that kept these villages running. But that trust would be put to the test in a way that no one could have imagined. In Webster County, an area marked by deep valleys and dense forest, there was a secluded property that served as a resting point for travelers. It wasn't a real inn, but a place where people who were passing through could spend the night, feed their horses, and leave in the morning. People in the area knew the family that ran the place well. They were hard workers, kept to themselves, and were always ready to help anyone who needed a place to stay. Nobody thought anything was wrong, and why would they? Back then, a handshake meant something, and a promise was worth more than any written contract. But in the months before fall that year, people in the nearby villages started to worry about something. People who were just passing through the area vanished. Of course, not all of them did, because that would be too obvious. But here and there, someone who should have made it to their destination never did. Merchants moving goods, men looking for work on farms, and women traveling to see family members who lived far away all disappeared without a trace. Families always got the same answer when they asked. No one had seen or heard anything. The sheriff in the area started getting random reports, like letters from worried family members and questions about where people who had left weeks before and never contacted anyone else were. But it was almost impossible to look into disappearances back then. The distances were huge, communication was slow, and a lot of people just changed course without telling anyone. It was easy to think that the people who went missing were just unlucky, had made a sudden decision to move to another state, or had been in an accident on the dangerous roads that cut through the mountains. But one thing started to stand out. Some of the missing people had something in common. They all went through the same area, and they all said they would stop at that remote property to rest. After that, no one saw them again. Is it a coincidence? Maybe, but when too many coincidences happen, they start to look like a pattern, and patterns need to be explained. The problem was that there wasn't much concrete proof at that time. There were no surveillance photos, detailed guest lists, or reliable ways to keep track of movements. Instead, there were only rumors, whispers, and a growing sense of unease that hung over Webster County like a fog that wouldn't go away. Something happened at the end of that year that changed everything. It made the authorities take a closer look at that peaceful property in the hills. It revealed secrets so dark that even now, more than a century later, it's hard to fully understand how horrible things were there. A farmer who lived nearby was the first to notice something odd. He drove along the road that ran along the property every day to bring food to the nearest village to sell. The smell coming from that direction that October morning was impossible to miss. It didn't smell like a farm. It wasn't manure or animals. It was something else that made your stomach turn, and your mind look for answers you didn't want to find. The man chose to look into it. He took a side path that led to the back of the property where there was an old barn and some smaller buildings that were used for storage. What he saw there left him frozen for a long time. Personal items strewn across the floor, open suitcases, clothes thrown into dark corners, and things that clearly belonged to different people, like pocket watches, leather wallets, and shoes of different sizes. It was as if dozens of people had their lives cut short and their traces were left behind, out of sight of anyone passing by on the main road. The farmer didn't waste any time. He got on his horse and rode quickly to the nearest town, where he found the sheriff having coffee in a small bar. It sounded like something out of a nightmare when he told it. At first, the sheriff didn't believe it, but he decided to get some men together and go to the site. That afternoon, what they found confirmed their worst fears. The property hid evidence of something that went beyond any normal crime. It wasn't just a robbery or random violence. It was something that was planned, carried out over months or even years. More information came out in the days that followed. Some of the victims could be identified thanks to documents found in their belongings. There were letters addressed to people who would never get them, travel logs, and personal notes. Each object told a story that was cut short. A merchant who was supposed to come to Springfield to meet a partner, a woman who was going to Kansas City to start a new life, and a farm worker who was going west to look for work. Everyone had faith in that family's hospitality and thought they would be safe there for one night. The people who owned the place were arrested right away. They denied everything when they were questioned. They said that guests had left the things behind over the years, that they didn't know where they came from, and that they had never hurt anyone. But the proof went against everything that was said. There were marks on the barn walls that showed it had been changed recently, tools were hidden in strategic places, and there was a pattern that couldn't be explained by chance alone. Local newspapers wrote about the case a lot. The Missouri Gazette ran a long article about the disappearances that linked together things that had previously seemed unrelated. Other magazines and newspapers did the same. Soon, families all over the state started calling the police to report missing relatives who had gone through that area. The size of what had happened was starting to show itself, and it was much bigger than anyone had thought at first. The authorities had a huge problem. How could they show what had happened to each of those people? There were no direct witnesses, only the belongings, the silence of the accused, and a set of circumstances that pointed to a terrible conclusion. The county prosecutors knew they would need more than just circumstantial evidence to get a conviction. They would have to put the pieces of information together that had been scattered over months of investigation and figure out what happened. And then, something strange happened. Someone spoke up. It wasn't a family member. It was someone who had worked on the property for a while, and now, because the authorities were putting pressure on them, they knew they couldn't stay quiet any longer. The information this person would give would completely change the direction of the investigation, revealing things that no one could have guessed. The witness was a worker who had been on the property for a few months in the summer of 1911. He had been hired to help with farm work, like fixing fences, taking care of the animals, and fixing the buildings. At the time, he hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. It was just a normal family living off the land and sometimes welcoming travelers. But now, with the police breathing down his neck and feeling guilty, he started to remember things that at the time seemed unimportant. There were strange things going on, like people stopping talking when he got close, nighttime meetings where he wasn't invited, and most importantly, the unspoken rule that he should never go into the barn after dark. The reason was always vague, something about dangerous tools or an unstable structure. But the way the family insisted on this point, and the tension in their voices made it clear that there was more to it than just safety concerns. The worker thought back to a specific night in August of that year. A couple had come to the property in the late afternoon by wagon from the north. They looked tired, dusty from the road, and happy to have found a place to rest. He watched them go into the main house and saw the family greet them with what seemed like hospitality, but there was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite put his finger on. When he woke up the next morning, he saw that the couple's wagon was parked near the barn, but the couple was nowhere to be found. He was told that the travelers had left before dawn because they were in a hurry to get back on the road. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. The cart was still there. Why would someone leave before dawn and leave behind their only way to get around? The worker didn't ask any questions at the time, maybe because he was scared or because he didn't want to see what was right in front of him. But that picture stayed in his mind, And now that he was talking to the police, he finally understood what he had seen. The authorities were able to figure out a way to do things with this testimony. The family drew in travelers by offering them a place to stay. They then waited for the right time, which was usually at night when the victims were most vulnerable, and then they acted. The things were put in different places and hidden in the barn so they could be sold or thrown away later. People took the horses and wagons to faraway places and traded them in other towns where no one would know what was going on. The victims just vanished into the vastness of rural Missouri, where so many people moved around without keeping a clear record of where they were going. As time went on, newspapers wrote more and more about the case. The Springfield Leader wrote a number of articles about each new piece of evidence that came to light in the investigation. A special reporter from the Kansas City Star will cover the trial that is coming up. The story caught the public's attention in a way that few cases had before. It wasn't just how horrible the crimes were, it was also how much family had broken the trust that was sacred in American West culture. The tradition of hospitality, which meant that a traveler could be safe under someone's roof. The prosecutors were under a lot of pressure. The community wanted justice, but the legal system at the time had a lot of problems. There were no bodies and no direct witnesses to the crimes, so the case relied on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of people who had worked on the property. The defense lawyers took advantage of every hole in the law, questioned the evidence's validity, offered other explanations, and questioned the witnesses' credibility. But it was hard to ignore the huge amount of circumstantial evidence. During the trial, a question came up that would be talked about for decades. How could such big crimes happen without anyone noticing? How could a whole community not know what was going on right next door? The answers were disturbing. The region was very big. Counties didn't communicate well with each other, and people at the time tended to just move on without asking many questions. All of this made it possible for predators to operate with relative impunity. It was a sad reminder of how fragile progress and civilization were, even though people didn't want to admit it. And then, in the middle of the trial, something strange happened. A witness showed up. Someone no one expected to see. Someone whose story would shed new light on the whole case and show even more disturbing things about this tragic event that people had forgotten about. The witness was a woman who had lived. She walked into the courtroom slowly, her face covered in scars that weren't visible to the naked eye, but were clear in every careful movement and quick glance at the accused. At the time, her name wasn't widely known. This was done by the authorities to protect her identity and give her time to rebuild her life after everything that happened. But what she said would change how people thought about the case completely. It was a rainy afternoon in April 1912 when she got to the property. She was traveling alone, which was unusual for a woman at the time, but she had to go because of what was going on in her life. She was going west to a small rural school where she could get a job. The heavy rain made her look for shelter, and when she saw the property by the side of the road, it seemed like a blessing. The family seemed to be kind to her when they welcomed her, giving her warm food and a dry place to sleep. But there was something wrong with that house that made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way the family members looked at her, like they were judging her and making plans. Maybe it was the whispers she heard when they thought she was asleep. Or maybe it was just a basic survival instinct, that voice inside us that tells us when something is very wrong. She acted like she was more tired than she was, and stayed awake all night with a small knife in her hand that she had hidden in her luggage. She heard footsteps coming toward the room where she was staying in the middle of the night. As it slowly opened, the door creaked. She stayed still, controlling her breathing and keeping her eyes half open so she could see through the dark. A shadowy figure came in, moving slowly, and then another, and then another. At that moment, she knew that the next few seconds would determine whether she lived or died. She got out of bed, screamed, ran to the window, and broke it with a chair. She cut herself on the glass but didn't care about the pain. She jumped out and ran into the dark woods around her. They ran after her. She could hear the voices behind her, the lanterns cutting through the dark, and the sound of branches breaking under heavy feet. But she was familiar with forests. She had lived in a place like that before, so she knew how to move through the trees and use the dark to her advantage. She ran for hours until the sun came up and the sounds of the chase stopped. She kept walking until she found a new road. Eventually, she came to a farm where nice people helped her get to the police. The defense was hurt badly by what she said. This person had been inside that house and had seen firsthand what the family was planning. They had only gotten away by sheer luck and bravery. She talked about the layout of the house in a way that only someone who had been there could know. She talked about conversations she had heard before pretending to sleep, bits of dialogue that made it sound like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The defense lawyers tried to make her testimony seem less credible by saying she was confused and that the fear and darkness had messed up her memories. But she stood her ground, answering each question clearly and in a way that was consistent with all the other evidence that had been presented. The jury watched her in silence, and you could see on the faces of those men how they slowly came to understand how close they had come to a terrible event that night in April. What she said about how the family worked together made her testimony even more powerful. It wasn't just one person acting alone or one crazy person. It was a coordinated effort with each person doing their part. Some lured victims in with fake hospitality. Others kept an eye on the roads to find possible targets, and still others took care of what happened next. It was a cold, efficient machine that showed no signs of being human or feeling bad. Newspapers wrote a lot about her testimony, but they were careful not to give away any information that could lead to her being identified. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch wrote an editorial about the case's larger implications, saying that it showed how weak a society is that is still trying to establish order and law within its own borders. It wasn't just about the crimes themselves, but also about the cracks in society that made them possible. The survivor's testimony had effects that went far beyond the courtroom. In the weeks that followed, more people came forward, each bringing bits of information they had kept to themselves for years because they were afraid to speak or didn't understand how important what they knew was. That woman's bravery seemed to have opened the floodgates, letting other people finally speak up and share their own troubling stories. A merchant who traveled the roads of Missouri a lot said he saw the property several times in 1910 and 1911. He had never stayed there overnight. He always wanted to keep going to the next town. But he had seen something strange. He had seen horses and wagons parked near the barn a few times, but never the people who owned them. When he brought this up in casual conversations with other merchants, they always gave him the same answer. The travelers probably kept going on foot or got a ride with someone. Now that he thought about it, he realized that those abandoned cars told a much darker story. A woman who owned a small boarding house in a nearby town remembered something that happened in 1911. A man had come to her boarding house late at night, upset, with ripped clothes, and looking like he had run a long way. He asked for a room, paid for it with coins he took from a ripped pocket, and then locked himself in for 2 days. When he finally came out, he looked haunted and kept looking over his shoulder as if he thought someone was following him. She tried to talk to him and offer help, but he just shook his head and walked away quickly, going north. He never said what had happened or contacted the police. He just vanished, probably taking with him secrets about what he had seen or done. These extra accounts helped the police put together a more accurate timeline of the crimes. It was clear that the activity had started long before 1909, which was the date of the first entry in the notebook that was found. There was proof that it had been going on since at least 1907. This meant that for at least 5 years, and maybe longer, That family had been able to do whatever they wanted without fear of getting caught, thanks to the trust of innocent travelers and the flaws in the justice system at the time. During the trial, we also learned more about why so many people had kept quiet for so long. Fear was a big part of it. The family had ties to many communities, knew powerful people, and there were whispered rumors about what happened to people who talked too much or asked questions that made people uncomfortable. These weren't just rumors that didn't mean anything. There were reports of possible witnesses being scared, of people getting threatening visits in the middle of the night, and of messages being left on doors to keep people from being too curious. There was also the social stigma. In a time when reputation was everything, being linked to such a scandal could destroy a whole family. Many people would rather be quiet than admit they had been tricked, that they had trusted monsters, or that they might have even sent friends or family into that trap without meaning to. People felt guilty and ashamed, and many chose to keep their feelings to themselves instead of facing public judgment. Prosecutors also found something that made the case even more complicated emotionally. Some of the victims were people who were running away from problems in other parts of the country. Men and women in debt, women escaping bad home situations, people who chose to take isolated routes on purpose so they wouldn't be found. Because many of the victims were only there for a short time and kept to themselves, it was even easier for the crimes to go unnoticed. Who will look for someone who is hiding when they go missing? Who will miss them? The family that was accused took advantage of this weakness with careful planning. The trial also revealed aspects of the psychology behind the crimes that were difficult to process. People who studied human behavior, like doctors and scholars, were asked to explain how a whole family could do such terrible things. There were different theories. Some said that it was a matter of power, with one person controlling others through fear or manipulation. Some people said that the isolation of rural life and the economic problems that came with it had slowly worn down moral boundaries until what was once unthinkable became normal. But maybe the most upsetting explanation was the simplest. Some people are just really good at making others feel less than human. The travelers were not people with hopes, fears, and families waiting for them. They were just chances to be taken advantage of. This coldness, this total lack of empathy, went beyond simple explanations and forced society to face very uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human. As the trial went on, the defense tried one last, desperate move. They said that outside forces had corrupted the family and that they were as much victims as the travelers, being manipulated by things they couldn't control. But the prosecutors countered with evidence of meticulous planning, deliberate organization, and a logbook that demonstrated a clear awareness of what they were doing. There was no room for pleas of insanity or coercion when the evidence showed such premeditation. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 3 days during which the entire Missouri region held its breath, awaiting a verdict that would somehow restore moral order, that would prove that even on the wildest frontiers, justice could still prevail. The courtroom galleries remained packed throughout this period, with people keeping vigil outside, discussing every aspect of the case, speculating about the outcome. When the jury finally returned, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The verdict was read in a firm voice without hesitation, guilty on all counts. The relief that swept through the room was palpable, but mixed with something darker, an understanding that no verdict could truly undo what had been done. No sentence could bring back those who had been lost in the dark hills of Webster County. The sentence was pronounced on a cold March morning in 1913. The judge, a gray-haired man who had served the law in Missouri for over 30 years, spoke in a heavy voice, burdened by the weight of what the case represented. He acknowledged the unprecedented gravity of the crimes, the systematic violation of the trust that formed the fabric of society, the calculated coldness with which everything had been carried out. The words echoed through the silent courtroom, each sentence a condemnation not only of the accused, but of everything they represented. The sentences were the harshest allowed by the law at the time. There would be no possibility of clemency, no second chances. The family members were separated, sent to different penal institutions scattered throughout the state, a measure taken both for security reasons and to prevent them from maintaining any form of communication or mutual influence. It was as if the authorities wanted not only to punish them, but to completely erase the connection that had made that machine of horrors possible. But the end of the trial did not bring the closure many had hoped for. In fact, it opened a new phase of questioning and discovery that would extend for years. Authorities now faced the monumental task of trying to identify all the victims, of bringing some form of answer to the dozens of families who had lost loved ones on Missouri roads. The notebook provided clues, but many entries were cryptic codes that no one could fully decipher. Teams were put together just for this purpose. They traveled throughout the state, visiting small towns, consulting cemetery records, talking to local sheriffs, trying to connect names in the notebook with real people who had disappeared. It was frustrating and often unsuccessful work. Many of the victims were migrants, people without deep roots in any specific place, and tracing their stories was like trying to follow footprints in the sand after a storm. They were able to do it in some cases. One entry dated October 1910 corresponded to the disappearance of a blacksmith who had left Tennessee heading west. His sister, who lived in Nashville, had been looking for him for years. She wrote letters to officials in different states, never giving up hope of finding him alive. When she finally got the news, decades of not knowing turned into clear sadness and a strange sense of relief. She was glad the long wait was over. A pocket watch that was found among the things hidden in the barn helped identify the person. It was a one-of-a-kind item with engraved initials and a special mechanism that made a melody when it was opened. The family knew it right away. The patriarch owned it. He left Illinois in 1911 to look for business opportunities in the West and never came back. They thought he had just decided to move on with his life somewhere else, maybe because he was embarrassed about failing in business. The truth was much darker, but for every successful identification, there were a dozen cases that remained unsolved. Belongings that no one recognized, entries in the notebook that didn't correspond to any recorded disappearance, fragments of lives that had been cut short without leaving enough trace to reconstruct who those people were or where they came from. These unsolved cases haunted investigators, always reminding them of how limited justice is and how easy it was to erase lives before centralized records and instant communication. People in the area had a lot to say about the property where the crimes happened. Some people said it should be burned because the place was cursed and needed to be cleansed by fire. Some people said it should be kept as a kind of sad memorial, a permanent reminder of how dangerous it is to trust people blindly and how important it is to always be on guard. The county finally made the choice. The site was sold at auction, and a farmer from another area who had nothing to do with the events bought the land with the plan to tear down the buildings and start over. People from all over the area came to see the house and barn being torn down. People seemed to need to see those buildings torn down to believe that this chapter was really coming to an end. When the walls finally fell, they showed something no one expected. More things hidden in the spaces between the floorboards, in secret compartments under the floorboards, and in carefully made spaces inside the walls. The family was even more careful and paranoid than anyone had thought. They made hiding places on top of hiding places to hide the evidence of their crimes. These new discoveries made the investigations take even longer. They had to make lists of missing people, take pictures of each new object they found, and compare them to those lists. The process took a lot of time and money from the county, but officials thought it was the right thing to do for the victims and their families. It was a matter of honor to show that justice always came, even if it took a long time, and that every life lost and every person who went missing deserved to be remembered. The news continued to cover the events, but the tone of the articles changed over time. The first few months' headlines were full of sensationalism, but they were followed by more in-depth looks at the case's social effects. The Chicago Tribune ran a long article about how to stop crimes like this from happening again. It suggested changes to the traveler registration system and better coordination between different areas. The New York Times sent a reporter to Missouri for weeks to write a series of reports that looked at the crimes themselves as well as the social and economic conditions that made them possible. Scholars also started to look into the case. Law professors used it as an example when talking about circumstantial evidence and how hard it is to prosecute crimes when there are no bodies. Sociologists viewed it as a lens for comprehending American rural existence in the early 20th century, encompassing its vulnerabilities and systemic shortcomings. The case became a topic of national conversation about modernization, law and order, and the human costs of developing the American frontier. For the survivor who spoke at the trial, life went on in ways she could never have imagined on that awful night in April. She finally got to the West, where she took the teaching job that was waiting for her. She then tried to start over in a new place, far away from the memories of that place. But historians found the letters she left behind decades later and learned that she had never really gotten away. She had nightmares, and the fear of trusting strangers never really went away. She also had to deal with the fact that she had survived by pure luck, while so many others did not have the same chance. The families of the known victims had their own complicated grieving process. Some people found comfort in finally knowing what happened to their loved ones, even though it hurt. Some people fell into a deep depression because they couldn't handle how horrible what had happened was. Some families left Missouri because they couldn't bear to live in a place that was so connected to tragedy. Some people stayed, though, because they wanted to keep the memory of the dead alive and make sure that their names weren't forgotten, along with the crimes that took them from this world. One of the most troubling things that came to light during the investigations after the trial was how much the community knew. It became clear that rumors about that family had been going around for years, as more people felt safe to talk. These weren't direct accusations, but rather hints, whispers, and the kind of unspoken knowledge that spreads through small groups. A lot of people knew something was wrong, but no one did anything about it. Fear, doubt, and a desire not to cause trouble had all played a role in the silence that let the crimes go on. This news made a lot of people in the area think about themselves. Church sermons talked about the idea of community responsibility and how important it is to speak up when something seems wrong, even if you're not sure what to do. Editorials in newspapers talked about how complacency is dangerous and how civilization depends not only on written laws, but also on the willingness of regular people to protect each other. It was a way for everyone to let out their feelings and try to find some meaning or lesson in a tragedy that seemed impossible to understand. The years after the trial saw huge changes in the whole area. The case had shown flaws in the system that no one wanted to admit were there, and now there was more and more pressure for big changes. The governor of Missouri set up a special commission to look into how crimes of this size had gone unnoticed for so long and what could be done to stop them from happening again after the public outcry. For months, the commission traveled around the state, listening to sheriffs, judges, regular people, and law enforcement experts. They found a broken system where counties acted like separate kingdoms, with little communication between them and no central database of crimes or missing people. If someone traveled to Webster County, they could disappear, and no one in Greene County would know, unless someone made an effort to report it. It was a problem that affected the whole system, and needed solutions that affected the whole system. The Commission's suggestions were thorough and, at the time, very new. They suggested setting up a statewide system for missing persons, where all jurisdictions would have to report cases that haven't been solved to a central authority. They said that sheriffs should have to go through training on how to look into disappearances and how to spot patterns that could mean organized crime. They also suggested making a statewide investigative force that could go across county lines when needed, getting around the jurisdictional limits that had made past investigations so difficult. Not all of these ideas were put into action right away. There was resistance, especially from local governments that saw the changes as an attack on their freedom. Some people said that the case was an outlier, a one-time event that didn't warrant big changes to the whole system. But supporters of the reforms kept going, using the case as a real-life example of how dangerous it is to be complacent and not work together. Over the next few years, many of the suggestions were put into action, which changed the way Missouri dealt with crime and missing persons in a big way. The investigation into the full extent of the crimes, on the other hand, went on. Local historians and dedicated investigators worked for years to put together a complete timeline, find all possible victims, and map out the links between different cases. One of these investigators, a retired detective who couldn't let go of the case, spent the last 10 years of his life working on it. He traveled thousands of miles, went to many cities, and talked to hundreds of people, always looking for the next clue that would give him another identity or story. His work showed interesting and disturbing patterns. He learned that the family that was accused had been very picky about who they chose to hurt. They stayed away from people who had strong ties to their communities, since their disappearance would lead to immediate and intense searches. They instead focused on migrants, temporary workers, and people who were moving from one life to another. These people had become invisible to the people around them for a number of reasons, which made them perfect targets. The investigator also found proof that the family had some kind of knowledge about how to get around and where people were moving. They knew when certain roads got busier, when seasonal workers usually came through the area, and when merchants had more money to spend. This information didn't come from luck or casual observation. It came from years of careful observation, strategic conversations in markets and taverns, and building networks of people who could give them information in different communities. They had turned rural hospitality, one of the most sacred parts of American culture, into a weapon against the weak. One of the most shocking things the investigator found came from records in a county that was almost 200 kilometers away. He discovered records of a 1906 investigation, 6 years before the main case, into another family that was doing things in a similar way. There were no formal charges brought as a result of that investigation because there wasn't enough evidence, but the patterns described in the documents were very similar to ones I had seen before. The investigator started to look into family ties between that family and the one in Webster County. They found marriages that linked the two groups, letters that suggested they worked together, or at least knew each other, and other evidence of family ties. This discovery opened up a terrifying possibility, that there was a long-standing tradition of taking advantage of travelers. It wasn't just a small group of criminals. It could have been a practice that had been passed down and improved over the years. The investigator told the authorities what he had found, and they reopened old cases and started looking at other unsolved ones in a new way. What came out was a picture that was much bigger and darker than anyone had thought at first. Even years after the trial, journalists were still interested in the case. A Harper's Magazine reporter spent months in Missouri in 1915 doing research for a long, in-depth article. He not only went over the facts of the case again, but he also looked into how it affected the community's mental health in the long term. He talked to people who lived near the property and knew the family before the crimes were found out. He felt a lot of different things: guilt for not noticing, anger for being tricked, and fear that it could happen to someone else. One of the most telling interviews was with a merchant who had been selling things to the family for years. He said that they acted like normal people in all of their public interactions. They were polite when they talked to people, paid their bills on time, and sometimes went to community events. There were no signs on the outside of the horrible things they did in private. In a way, this fake normalcy was more disturbing than if they had been obviously suspicious or strange. It meant that monsters could hide in plain sight and that looking decent didn't mean anything about a person's true character. The case also had an effect on the art and literature of the time. Writers started to put things from the story into their own work, looking at themes like broken trust, hidden dangers in the American landscape, and how fragile civilization is in far-off places. Some of these works were sensationalist, focusing on the horror of the crimes in ways that were almost exploitative. Others were more thoughtful, using the case as a starting point for deeper thoughts on human nature, community, and the dark sides of every society. A local poet, who was very moved by the tragedy, wrote a series of poems about the victims in an effort to give them a voice and restore their dignity. They had been reduced to entries in a notebook and forgotten belongings in a barn. His poems didn't talk about the crimes themselves. Instead, they talked about the lives that had been cut short, the dreams that would never come true, and the conversations that would never happen. It was his way of fighting against dehumanization by making sure that each victim was a whole person with a past, hopes, and worth. The case was hard for the institutions that the convicted family members were sent to. Guards and administrators had never had to deal with this many criminals of this kind before. There were arguments about how to deal with prisoners who had shown they could be so violent in a planned and systematic way. Some people wanted them to be completely alone because they were afraid they would have a bad effect on other prisoners. Some people thought this would be cruel, and that even people who had done terrible things still had some basic rights. Doctors and psychologists who worked with the convicts over the years made observations that were very disturbing. Most family members never really felt bad about what they did. Some people didn't say anything at all and wouldn't talk about the crimes or why they did them. Some people gave reasons that showed they were completely out of touch with the moral reality that most people share. They talked about the victims as if they were problems to be solved or roadblocks that had stopped them from reaching their goals, not people whose lives had value in and of themselves. A prison doctor wrote a very detailed report in 1916 about talking to one of the family's youngest members. This person had been a criminal since they were a teenager, growing up in a place where crime was normal and just a part of life. The doctor wondered what it would be like to grow up in such an environment and how it would affect how people learn about morality and what happens when the lessons are wrong. It was an early look into ideas that would become very important to criminology and psychology many years later. In the years that followed, the property where the crimes happened had different fates. The farmer who bought it after the auction tore it down and built a new house far away from the old ones. He worked the land for years and made it grow, but there was always a shadow over it. People in the area didn't want to work there, and kids made up scary stories about ghosts and curses. The farmer's family decided to sell when he died, and the property changed hands several times in the 20th century. Every new owner had to deal with the same problem. Should they openly talk about the place's dark past, or try to forget about it and move on? Some people chose to be open about the past, knowing that it was a part of the land and couldn't just be erased. Some people tried to avoid the topic completely, thinking that the memories would fade over time. But the history lived on, passed down from generation to generation, kept alive not only by morbid curiosity but also by a shared need to remember the painful lessons learned at such a high cost. The next few years changed that area in ways that no one could have predicted. The land that had seen such terrible things started to change, both in real life and in the minds of the people who lived there. The forests kept growing. The rivers kept flowing in the same way they always had, and slowly but surely, nature began to take back the places that had been marked by tragedy. It was as if the land was trying to start over, covering up the past with the lush green growth of life that won't be stopped. In the years that followed, travelers who passed through that part of Missouri often stopped at small taverns and ended up telling old stories. The elders told stories they had heard from their parents and grandparents. Each generation added its own meaning to events that happened long ago. Some of these stories were surprisingly accurate, keeping details that might have been lost otherwise. Some had changed over time, adding elements of folklore and turning into stories about trust and betrayal, as well as warnings about the dangers of judging people by how they look. One interesting thing about this oral transmission was that different communities focused on different parts of the story. Some villages were more interested in the investigators and how hard they worked to get justice despite huge problems. In some stories, the focus was on the victims, who became almost mythical figures, symbols of lost innocence and dreams that were cut short. And there were places where the stories asked more philosophical questions, using what happened as a jumping-off point for talks about what evil is and how to spot danger when it looks like normalcy. History came back in surprising ways during times of big social change. When roads began to be paved and communications improved, fundamentally transforming how people traveled and connected, many pointed to those ancient events as examples of why such improvements were necessary. The new technologies were not just about convenience, they argued, but about security, about creating networks that would prevent people from simply disappearing without a trace. It was a way of transforming historical trauma into motivation for progress. Those faraway events gave writers and artists endless ideas, both those who wanted to sensationalize them and those who were truly interested in exploring deeper themes. One playwright, who worked in the years after the events, wrote a play that didn't show the crimes directly, but instead told the story of a made-up community that had unknowingly kept monsters hidden. The play looked at group guilt, moral duty, and the troubling question of how much a person should doubt their neighbors and how much they should trust that people are basically good. People talked a lot about this play after they saw it in small theaters all over Missouri and nearby states. Some people thought it was too close to what really happened and that it would reopen wounds that needed time to heal. Some people said that art could help people face the uncomfortable parts of human nature, and that theater and literature could be safe places to deal with themes that were too hard to talk about directly. These tensions between remembering and forgetting, between facing the past and moving on, would shape how the area dealt with its dark past for many years to come. Teachers also found ways to use the events to teach, but they did so very carefully and with a lot of thought. In some rural schools, teachers used elements of history to teach about critical thinking, the importance of asking difficult questions, and how social systems function or fail. It wasn't about scaring students with graphic details. It was about using a local historical case to show how justice, community, and personal responsibility work in general. These lessons were particularly impactful because they weren't abstract. They came from events that had occurred in the very region where the students lived, in places they could visit, at a time that was still within reach of living memory through grandparents and great-grandparents. The physical landscape of the area also bore the marks of those events in subtle but persistent ways. Some roads that used to be major travel routes were slowly left behind as new ones were built. This was partly for practical reasons and partly because no one wanted to go through places that were so closely linked to tragedy. These old roads became secondary paths, covered by invasive vegetation, their boundaries increasingly difficult to discern from the surrounding forest. Hikers occasionally encountered them and wondered what stories those paths might tell if they could speak. Sometimes it seemed like history might finally fade away and become just another footnote in old books that no one reads anymore. but something always happened to bring it back to the public's attention. Perhaps a researcher would discover a new set of documents in a forgotten archive. Perhaps a descendant would finally decide to tell their family's story. Or perhaps contemporary events would resonate in ways that made people look back, searching for historical parallels, trying to understand patterns that seemed to repeat themselves across generations. One such resurgence occurred when renovations to an old courthouse building revealed boxes of documents that had been stored and forgotten for decades. Among them were letters written by people who had testified at the original trial, personal reflections never intended for the public eye. These letters gave us a close look at how people had dealt with their feelings about what they had been through and how they had tried to make sense of their beliefs about human goodness in light of what they had seen. Reading these letters decades later felt like opening an emotional time capsule that held raw feelings that had been carefully kept from the public at the time. One letter that really hit home was from a jury member, written years after the trial. He talked about how the experience had completely changed how he saw the world, how he could never trust strangers the same way again, and how nightmares about the case had haunted him for years. He also wrote about a strange kind of gratitude for being on that jury. He said that even though it was hard, it was the best thing that people could do to respond to the worst, a commitment to justice, procedure, and the search for truth, even when that truth was scary. People who grew up decades after the events had complicated relationships with the history. For some, it was a way for their little-known area to be known for something, even if it was something bad. For some, it was a burden, a stigma that made it hard to get new residents or businesses to move there. They thought it was unfair that the area was still associated with violence after so much time had passed. People sometimes got into heated arguments at town hall meetings or in the letters sections of local newspapers about whether they should accept, ignore, or somehow come to terms with their dark past. As time went on and direct witnesses disappeared, the story became almost mythical, which is interesting. As the story went on, specific details started to mix together, dates became less clear, and the story started to sound like an urban legend. This process of mythification was not inherently detrimental. Some scholars contended that it transmuted particular events into archetypal narratives concerning universal themes, rendering them pertinent to subsequent generations lacking direct ties to the original context. The story shifted from specific facts to more general truths about people that went beyond the details of history, but making myths out of things also had risks. As the details got less clear, it was easier for people with certain goals to change the story to fit their needs. Some people used the story to say that the present is better than the past, ignoring problems that are happening now. Some people used it to make people paranoid or to support policies that kept people out. Serious historians were always having to fix mistakes and make sure that the story was based on facts that could be proven, even though they knew that some interpretation was necessary. The property where it all happened kept going through the years. Every new family that moved in had their own way of dealing with the weight of history. Some people tried to forget about it altogether and live their lives as if it never happened. Some people got involved in creative ways, like planting memorial gardens or letting historians do archaeological research without disturbing the site. Some people just lived with it, accepting that the past was part of the place's identity. They didn't celebrate it or deny it. They just accepted it as a fact of the land's emotional geography. As the 20th century went on and the 21st century began, ways to preserve history got a lot better. Researchers all over the world can now access archives that were once falling apart. Using modern technology, old photos were fixed up, bringing out details that had been hidden in faded copies, and oral records from some of the last living people who heard stories directly from participants were carefully recorded. These records kept not only facts but also tones of voice, speech patterns, and emotional stresses that written text alone could never capture. This preservation effort wasn't driven by morbid curiosity. It was driven by the belief that each generation has a duty to learn about its past, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. When people forget or deny their dark pasts, they are destined to make the same mistakes again. When people face these hard times honestly, they have the chance to learn and grow. The things that happened at that remote Missouri estate were a perfect example of this. They taught lessons about being alert, working together, justice, and the importance of systems that protect the weak that were still relevant years later. And so, we come to the end of this sad trip through Missouri's hills and valleys, along dusty roads where secrets were buried, and memories linger like morning mist that won't go away. This story, which came from my imagination, but is based on fears we all have, is a mirror for questions that have been asked for generations. What happens when trust is broken? How do communities deal with the fact that evil can look like normal? And most importantly, how do we move forward when we realize that the security we thought was guaranteed is not as strong as we thought? The area still has thick forests and endless horizons, which are silent witnesses to everything that happened and everything that could have happened. The roads still wind through the mountains, linking small towns that have grown and changed over the years. People who travel today go through these places without knowing the stories that the stones and trees could tell, or feeling the weight of the stories that have become part of the land itself. What bothers me the most is not the specific details of the events, but the bigger questions they bring up. How do we know when something is dangerous when it doesn't show itself with clear signs? In a world where we are always told to trust our gut, how much should we question what we see? What should we do when our gut feeling goes against the rules of politeness and hospitality in society? These are not simple questions, which may be why stories like this one continue to be told over and over again. The need to tell and retell these dark stories is very human. It's not just a morbid interest, that part is definitely there. It's also a way to deal with our shared fears and give shape to worries that would be too vague to face otherwise. When we hear stories about travelers who put their faith in the wrong people or communities that didn't see what was going on right in front of them, we are really looking at our own weaknesses and possible blind spots. Of course, the land where everything is said to have happened is still there. People farm fields, animals graze, and life goes on as usual, ignoring the marks the past has left. New families move in, make happy memories, celebrate birthdays and holidays, and plant gardens that bloom in the spring. Life's ability to persist, to regenerate, and to flourish even in the most barren conditions is arguably the most optimistic theme that arises from any account of tragedy. But we also need to be aware that some places hold stories that can never be completely erased. Not because they are haunted in a supernatural sense, but because they are haunted by human memory, by the way we tell and retell stories, and by the way places become places where meaning goes beyond their physical reality. A field is just a field, but when something important happens there, it becomes something more, a place where the past and present are in a productive tension. The lessons learned from these made-up events are just as important now as they were over 100 years ago. We live in a time when it's easier than ever to connect with others and harder than ever to hide disappearances. Communication systems have made it almost impossible for someone to just disappear without leaving a digital trail. But there are now new kinds of vulnerability that have taken the place of the old ones. The core principle persists: the necessity for vigilance, for protective systems for the vulnerable, and for communities that possess the commitment to pose difficult inquiries when anomalies arise. It's powerful to think about what it was like to travel back then, when distances seemed much longer. Days could go by without seeing another person, and finding a house that offered shelter could feel like a blessing from God. Because those roads were so quiet and those properties were so far away from other people, human dramas could happen without anyone seeing them. It was a very different world from ours, but basic human instincts, both good and bad, have always been the same. This story teaches us how important it is to keep our collective memory alive. We shouldn't get lost in the past. We should use it to make the present better. Every generation has its own problems, monsters, and systemic flaws that let unfairness thrive. It's not easy to judge those who came before us when we look back. Instead, we should learn to spot patterns, see through disguises, and build societies that make it harder for predators to hide in the shadows. The Missouri area, where all of this happened, whether real or not, is still a very beautiful place. Dense forests and deep valleys, which used to make people feel alone, now draw people looking for peace and a connection to wild nature. It serves as a reminder that nothing is inherently good or bad. Rather, the meaning we assign to places and situations is shaped by context and human behavior. As we finish this story, it's important to think about how stories change how we see the world. They are not just for fun, but they can be that too. We use them to help us understand the complicated and confusing parts of being human. When we hear about people who have broken trust, systems that have failed, and victims who never got full justice, we are really hearing about the basic conflicts that shape human life. Between the individual and the community, between freedom and safety, and between trust and verification. Missouri's wide-open spaces and long history made it the perfect place to explore dark themes. But the truth is that these things could have happened anywhere people live alone, where protection systems aren't very strong, and where trust is both needed and could be broken. Human dynamics, or the patterns of behavior that repeat themselves no matter where or when they happen, are more important than geography. Thank you for staying with us on this journey through unsettling stories and thoughts on human nature. The best way to enjoy stories like this is to share them with others, talk about them, and argue about them. If you like stories that deal with dark mysteries and deep human questions, you might like this one. The darkest stories often teach us the most important lessons about resilience, community, and the human ability to seek justice, even when things are very hard. We will keep looking into these stories, going to places in history that have been forgotten, and bringing to light events that changed communities and taught us things about who we are as a species. Stay curious and alert until the next story. Remember that knowing the past, even the darkest parts, helps us deal with the present.